My name is Jane. I live alone in an apartment in the Golden Triangle of Jakarta, or people call it the heart of Jakarta. I myself am an office worker who works at an insurance company that is headquartered in the capital city. I have been living alone for several months since my divorce from my husband, because we don't have children yet, so I can immediately be free from the bonds of this relationship. So we never meet again and don't even know each other anymore. Meanwhile, in the apartment, I am assisted by a household assistant. Her name is Mrs. Yumi. She's a native of my apartment. Because my multi-story apartment is directly adjacent to a densely populated residential area typical of Jakarta. Mrs. Yumi does not live in my apartment. She has her own working hours that I have set. When I am about to go to work, she comes and cleans the house until the evening. And when I arrive at the apartment, everything is done and clean thanks to Mrs. Yumi's work, so I can immediately relax and rest. Oh yeah, I also gave Mrs. Yumi a spare key in case she needs it later. I trust her anyway. One day I was almost late for work, but because Mrs. Yumi came and knocked on the door, I woke up and immediately got ready to go to work. Meanwhile, Mrs. Yumi did what she usually did every morning. Every morning I took the time to have breakfast at the porridge cellar in front of the apartment. But because this morning I was late, I really didn't have time for that. Even if I could get to the office on time, I was grateful. In short, I arrived at the office with my simple car, working as usual, meeting many friends and other things that employees usually do in general. Time went by so fast when I was in the office. I didn't realize that after almost a day of work and 2 breaks, I had reached the end of the day. Around 6 in the evening, I left the office to my car and started driving home. Actually, going home at night like this is something I hate, because the roads are always congested at this hour. Even if there wasn't a traffic jam, the trip wouldn't take more than 15 minutes. Because of the traffic jam, my trip, which was actually short, took 40 minutes. I arrived and parked my car in the basement, then walked to the elevator to go up to the 9th floor where I live. I was alone in the elevator, and when I arrived in the hallway, I was alone. The hallway was so quiet and silent. There was only me and the sound of my footsteps, plus the sound of the key turning in the door hole. I immediately went in and immediately took a glass of water from the kitchen and drank it. However, there was something odd at night. I saw that Mrs. Yumi had not come home yet and was ironing in one of the empty rooms in my apartment. Because the door was open, I could see her. I approached and intended to greet her. At that time, Mrs. Yumi was facing away from me, her head lowered while focusing on ironing my clothes. "You can do it tomorrow morning. Just go home," I said to Mrs. Yumi. "No, Mrs. Jane, now. I'm too lazy to go home early," Mrs. Yumi answered. I thought maybe Mrs. Yumi would. I immediately walked to the kitchen to make a glass of sweet tea. The cup was already there and the tea was ready. So I just, "Mrs. Jane, I'm sorry. I'll be home this afternoon. I'm sorry. I can't stay long today." That's what she said in the message. So Mrs. Yumi had been home since this afternoon. Then who was ironing in that empty room? Oh my God. I immediately contacted Mrs. Yumi. I immediately walked to the balcony and called her right away. Luckily, her response was fast. Mrs. Yumi answered her phone right away. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Jane. I came home earlier. I'll tell you tomorrow. There's something wrong in your apartment," she said in a tone that was as scared as mine. I immediately hung up the phone because there was nothing I needed to know anymore. Everything was clear. The person who was ironing was not Mrs. Yumi. I put my phone in my pocket and walked in. Braving myself, I walked towards the empty room. I wanted to make sure who was there. I had a bad feeling. Very bad. When I arrived at the front door of the room, the figure was still there. It looked exactly like Mrs. Yumi from behind. I also forgot that I hadn't seen her face. From the front door, I looked at the figure who was still ironing the same clothes. "Excuse me, who are you?" "Mrs. Yumi has gone home. How come you're here? I can call security, you know," I said with the intention of threatening. What made me shudder was when the figure giggled before answering. "Huh? You haven't realized it yet?" asked the figure while continuing to iron. "Come on." "Who am I?" asked the figure again. I was scared to death. My body was shaking violently. I wanted to run, but for some reason my eyes felt like they wanted to see the figure. Then the figure turned, then stood facing me, showing his flat face without eyes, nose and mouth, completely flat. I immediately ran while screaming because I was so scared. I left the apartment. I immediately ran to the elevator to go down to the ground floor. While in the elevator, I kept saying Istighfar. Oh my gosh. What figure did I just see? A spirit? Why is it in my apartment? Because of that incident, I didn't sleep in the apartment that night. I was forced to sleep at my parents' house in Bikasi, which was quite far away. The next day, I went to work as usual. I told Mrs. Yumi not to come to my apartment because I was not there. After coming home from work, I visited Mrs. Yumi's house. I told her what I experienced yesterday, and it turned out that Mrs. Yumi had experienced the same thing. That's why Mrs. Yumi came home early. Mrs. Yumi said that the creature resembled me, but when she turned around, her face was the same. After my family and I held a small religious study in the apartment, I finally dared to occupy the apartment again. Thank you for joining us on this journey. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for more tales of the unknown. Until next time, remember, some places are best left undisturbed.